Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Wexner Center for the Arts on one of our very distinguished evenings each year. So when we first approached Robert Stern some 18 months ago about presenting the Herb and DeeDee Glimcher Lecture, he was in the midst of planning celebrations for the 100th anniversary of the Yale University Architecture School, and naturally found it kind of difficult to commit to a date. We had to relent, but here we are, nothing if not patient, and sort of nothing if not tenacious, and that persistence has now been rewarded to our great delight. So for those of you who have followed the Glimcher Lecture over the years, you've probably come to expect a somewhat different generation of architects to take the podium, names like Tom Main, Liz Diller, Stephen Hall, David Adjaye, or the late Zaha Hadid. But tonight we chose to celebrate the remarkable career of a true eminence grise of the profession, one whose career spans 50 years of prolific architectural thought, writing, teaching, and practice. Robert A.M. Stern was seemingly born to build. His fascination with architecture and urban design emerged apparently very early on when, as a kid, he would be shuttled on the F train from Brooklyn into New York City and always insisted that he stand at the front of the car so he could see the skyline emerge when they came out from the tunnel. And I think it's fair to say that there is no architect on the planet, no other living architect certainly, that has altered that streetscape as much as Robert Stern. Having received his master's degree in architecture in 1965, he emerged on the scene at a seminal moment. If his peers were not necessarily always his compatriots, but they included the likes of Michael Graves, Frank Gehry, Richard Meyer, Peter Eisenman, Jacqueline Robertson, and Charles Moore. It was a heady time of fiercely contested design principles and sometimes shifting allegiances. But then, as now, Robert Stern possessed the courage of his convictions. As someone who's not afraid to admit that he loves limestone, and by the way, may be the most masterful manipulator of that material, someone who unabashedly admires the great buildings of an earlier era in New York, think McKim, Mead, and White, but not slavishly so, and someone who looks at the past, not with longing or nostalgia, but with a determination to remix the best attributes for the present day. And therein, one might say, lies the crux of what once led New York Magazine to refer to Bob Stern as unfashionably fashionable. That article goes on to note that rather than indulging in all manner of gimmickry, Stern beguiles with details, subtle moves that, quote, accumulate into a patina of understated opulence, which tends to make him a target for everything from quiet condescension to withering critique, especially in certain academic circles. But in others, he is revered. As dean of Yale School of Architecture for nearly 20 years, he not only rejuvenated the school, but led it to the pinnacle of respect and renown among its peers nationally and internationally. Yale's trustees, senior leaders, faculty, and students, rarely a united front, all universally agree and gratefully acknowledge that Stern made a profound impact there. And don't imagine that his legacy will be limited to pedagogy and fundraising. Impressive as those have both been, the incoming Yale class of 2021 will be accommodated in 2 brand new residential colleges, the first created in over 60 years, and in some ways, the single most expansive project that that college has ever undertaken, as well as its most expensive. That complex will be designed by none other than Robert A.M. Stern. Let me also add that when I contacted my colleagues here at the Knowlton School to tell them that we had secured a date, they were absolutely ecstatic. But whether ardent admirer or outspoken detractor, everyone in the field agrees on 2 things. Robert Stern stands among the most knowledgeable practicing architects in the field with an almost encyclopedic command of the history of architecture, particularly American architecture, And Robert Stern is the architect who used that knowledge to save Times Square. Not many of you may know the story, but you should. Last year, a record 59 million tourists flocked to Times Square as their starting destination in New York, attracted to its glittering, larger-than-life signage and all of the activity, all of the combustion of that place. But a visitor who may have arrived there 30, say, years before would have found a very dismal experience indeed. It had become really a shameful embarrassment to the city. But when in 1992, the city put in place the 42nd Street Development Corporation to study that spot and to transform it, who did they hire but Robert A.M. Stern? And I suspect that the city will be ever in his debt. While he could have held the stage solo this evening, he preferred a conversational format, and I immediately thought of Paul Goldberger as the ideal interlocutor. Goldberger, of course, has a long and distinguished career as an architectural critic, some 30 years at the New York Times, partially overlapping a 15-year stint at the New Yorker, and now as a contributing editor for Vanity Fair. I've known Paul and followed his work for a very long time. I think we first met, decades ago in Frank Gehry's office while we were both wandering around. And of course, among his many insightful books over the year is a brand new biography of Frank entitled Building Art, The Life and Work of Frank Gehry. And as it turns out, Paul just recently moderated a discussion among Robert Stern and his partners for a new book entitled City Living, which covers 15 different projects completed in New York, as well as another similar number of works currently underway. Paul clearly takes an ecumenical and erudite approach to the field. He is among the few critics I know that, on the one hand, can be talking with Robert A.M. Stern, on the other, with Frank Gehry, and give both their due. I know he can toggle back and forth relatively easily between the rival camps of neo-traditionalists and radical iconoclasts. It's among our pleasures to bring figures of this stature and this accomplishment to the Wexner Center year in and year out. We are so grateful to DeeDee and Herb Glimcher for underwriting this endowed lecture series, and with great appreciation to them and to my team at the Wexner Center and the Knowlton School, please join me now in a warm welcome for Robert A.M. Stern and Paul Goldberger. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you.
Lovely, thank you.
Thank you, Sherry. I think that was the best part of the evening.
Well, it was
introduction.
Thank you very much, Sherry. Could not have been nicer. Thank you all for being here, and Bob, thank you. We're going to start by just talking in general for a few minutes, and then in a little while we will switch back to slides and move more towards some of your buildings and give you a chance to talk somewhat about more specific buildings. But let me ask you first some more general things. There was an interesting piece that just appeared in the Columbia College magazine about you that refers to, or quotes you as referring to architecture, or defining architecture as the Janus-faced arch, looking both backwards and forwards. Yet, as Sherry reminded us, you've chosen in your own work to look primarily backwards, not forwards. Can we talk a little bit about that and about the decision to make history the sort of guiding principle of your work?
Well, when you say I look backwards, you make it sound like I want to go backwards.
Okay. I don't make it sound like that. You explain, please.
I think, not that I want to compare myself to Picasso quite, but artists like Picasso in another related field often went to look at work from the past to refresh themselves, and particularly if they finished a certain phase in their work and felt they'd mind that direction, they wanted to go somewhere else. I think that architecture, as historically practiced, has always looked backwards for inspiration, for rules and discipline. We live in an undisciplined era in many arts, including architecture and painting and sculpture, I would say. But some of us in those fields do respect the discipline that was evolved over a long period of time, especially from a period before the digital age, before machines and so forth, when things in the architecture world had to be built and one column. I say this at the Wexner Center, but I know it.
I wondered how long it would take
when
to
columns
mention
came
columns.
down to the ground or rose up from the ground. So I think
4 minutes it took.
I think one goes backwards
Okay.
to study, to learn. One brings things from the past to go forward. And I have no problem with that. And many of my colleagues, Sherry mentioned them, and I'm pretty good friends with quite a few of them, but they spend all their time trying to be ahead of each other. I'm just here, happy to be in the rear view mirror, coming along, doing buildings that I think set the stage for the next step and the next step. They can try to break the mold. I want to keep the mold, shape it and reshape it and refine it.
Where does that position, let's say, or that point, how does that jibe with the urbanistic question of background versus foreground? Do you see yourself as a maker of background buildings more than foreground buildings, or is that not even a valid distinction?
Oh, I think the distinction between background buildings and foreground buildings is extremely important. Paul Rudolph, my teacher, said that modern architects were incapable of making good background buildings. And he would point to the researches of Camillo Zitta, the Austrian theorist, city planner, who pointed out of the something like 500 churches in Rome, I'm making up the number, but something like 450 had only one or two, at the most 3 sides visible, and they were embedded into the wall or the fabric of the city. So most buildings should be background buildings. Now, that doesn't mean a library or some other civic building shouldn't be a foreground building, but even a foreground building should orchestrate and intensify its setting, not throw a pot of paint at the setting, as to mix my metaphors, really going badly tonight, but Ruskinian a metaphor or whatever. So we do lots of foreground buildings with pleasure, and I would welcome to do more if asked. But I think it's very important to make the contribution to the city. But the city is not, and of course my reference is cities like New York or London. Columbus is in a different stage of evolution, beginning maybe to become more urbanized than it has been for a long time. But a city is made up of streets, and the buildings along the streets can each be quite different, but they have to share characteristics, and the attitude of a building to the public way, to the street, is very important. And a building that just says, "me too," is not very good, in my way of thinking, as a city building.
Louis Kahn once said, the street is a room by agreement.
Right.
Which I always thought was a wonderful and very poetic way to put that point. By agreement of architects, by agreement of generations communicating with each other.
In my generation of architects, not necessarily Peter Eisenman, but definitely, say, Jack Robertson as the other side of the coin, or Alan Greenberg or Tom Beebe, we came on the scene at a moment when modernist architecture, the glass box and its variants, were dominant. Nobody could imagine any other kind of building, really, to speak of. Mies van der Rohe was in charge of the world, architecturally speaking, and his firm of Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, which we would call Three Blind Mies. were everywhere.
Right. And
But we looked around and we realized that architecture is more complex, has richer, and it's a narrative art. It tells stories about things. What does it mean to build for a certain institution or not? So I have quarrels, there's no doubt about it, with a lot of stuff that's built by my friends. I mean, they certainly have quarrels with me. But my quarrels are often the buildings are about the architects and not about the places they're built or even the activities that take place in them. And we see many museums, for example, where the art fights the building. I'm on the side of the art.
you know, that's a common trope, let's say, about museum architecture. But let's pick up on that for a moment. I mean, first, is there such a thing as true neutrality? It seems to me as if a white box is an aesthetic statement of its own, of a certain sort, no?
No, but I'm not interested in true neutrality. I don't think that's... on Sunday, it was a beautiful day like you have every day in Columbus, but we don't get them so often in New York. I decided I would pay a visit to the Metropolitan Museum, which had a couple of new exhibitions, which I was anxious to see, and then to go to Met Breuer, which is the old Whitney that the Met has taken over. And in the Met Breuer, I mean, the building is gloomy. It was gloomy. I was there the day it opened. I still think it's a gloomy building. I think the art looks horrible in the building, and most people look kind of horrible and gloomy in the building. What else can I say? They did a beautiful job restoring gloom.
Well, that would argue then that it's gloomier than ever, perhaps.
It is almost. But the Metropolitan Museum, and I'm sure all of you have visited it sometime or other, or the Art Institute in Chicago and a few other museums of great size I'm referring to. But you go in and rooms are different. The building itself has a civic presence on the street or in the edge of the park in the Met's case. And then you go in and the Greek art is in rooms that bespeak the art of Greece and Rome. And then when they used to show the Impressionist art in a kind of white box. It was like a shoebox.
Right.
And I think they realized that the art was being robbed of context, of richness, and great art can stand up to appropriate architecture. But I'm not in favor of the white box at all.
Okay. So you're... what about, while we're on a roll about other museums, what about the Guggenheim?
It's a great building. It's not such a great museum. People go there because of the building and even return. Someone like me, I would just like to go in there from time to time. Some art works very well in the Guggenheim. A lot of art doesn't work so well. It swamps the art. So it's an eccentric building. It opened up the game that we seem to be very much still at playing of art museums as self-referential temples of ego. Have I gone too far?
Well, Bob, we want you were invited here to go too far. It's fine.
I want to be loved.
But well, let's stay with that for a moment, because I think if there's a common thread between your observation about the Guggenheim and what you said about the Metropolitan, it's that, in fact, not all art works. No one building is right for everything. And in fact, there needs to be some relationship between the container and the thing contained, let's say, the art and that's being displayed and the building that it's being displayed in.
Well, the Guggenheim is an interesting case, not so much along the lines you're trying to get me to sink myself into. But Frank Lloyd Wright actually wanted the Guggenheim to be in a park. And he saw it as an object building.
Right.
And that is one of the great problems today. The Metropolitan Museum of Art is not an object building. It's a long facade by a number of architects, and then they've added around it. And it has an object side from the park, but on Fifth Avenue, it's a great city facade, and it's a civic building. So why must museums be object buildings? Why can't they engage into the fabric of the city? Anyhow, I just am interested in the city. I'm interested in the street. I'm interested in the relationship of buildings to streets, and I'm interested in buildings that you can stand in front of and read where they came from, where they cite them, situate them in the present, and imagine in the future. One of the problems with imagining buildings for the future is thinking about how you add on to them. That's another problem with the object building. The Guggenheim is very difficult to add on to, as Charles Gothard
Right, or discovered to his dismay, yes.
dismayed.
Yes.
The Breuer Museum cannot be added on to. The two major architects tried. Three
tried.
Each
yeah.
failed. Some of it was political, but a lot of it was just the sheer obduracy of the building. So, you know.
My feeling for the Whitney or the Met Breuer was that what they really should have done was hire you or Alan Greenberg or someone else to build to the south a sort of colonnaded row of traditional houses. And then in a few years, people would have said, what a shame they tore down the north end to build that building, actually.
It's funny you say that. When I was teaching at Columbia in my early middle period or whatever,
right.
I assigned the Whitney as a project because I knew a lot about, I'd done the Whitney as my thesis in school, but the Whitney was expanding. And a student who actually comes from Cleveland, so it's pretty close to hand.
Okay.
Richard, I can't think of his last name, I'm horribly embarrassed. Anyhow, he did this scheme saying that you should add a classical building to the Whitney, and it had great volutes and so forth. And Arthur Drexler, I'd been invited him to be on the jury. He was so smitten with the design, he put it in the museum's collection.
Oh, wow.
So, I mean, there was already in the early 80s a sense that the way to go forward was the way to go via going back. We've lost too much. Not everybody would agree, but some would. I mean, look at this building, the Wexner building, the center. I mean, after all, Peter rebuilt a portion or an interpretation of the building that was torn down. Why did he do that? Some inner psyche, part of his psyche said you need to connect. Or maybe somebody told him to do it. I don't know.
I don't know either. Well, it was at the time that postmodernism was still sort of on the ascent. And I think that was, in a way, Peter's somewhat contrarian interpretation of the postmodern impulse, perhaps.
I think he called me up and told me I'd like it.
And was he right?
No comment.
Okay.
Not my favorite building. As Jeff Kipnis, who's I think in the audience, knows.
Right. Let's talk about postmodernism, in fact. I mean, you were very early and active in that movement, and it seemed to be born out of a desire to forge some kind of synthesis between historical form and different and invented form, for want of a better term. And your work early on seemed very influenced by Robert Venturi's. There was Michael Graves' own direction, somewhat different. And then after a few years, it sort of petered out a bit, and your work became more literally traditional. Others seemed to go in a somewhat different direction from it. And now we're in the odd position of having more glass boxes than ever.
It is amazing, isn't it?
It is amazing to think that sort of, what was postmodernism all about, and what was its historical impact and meaning given all that?
Well, I think postmodernism is two different things. The term is applied to two different things. One, in architectural stylistic terms, it was, as Paul described it, a recapturing of forms from the past. Sometimes it got a bit out of control, a bit jokey, a bit maybe too playful, but then architecture could use a little bit of smiles and play every now and again, takes itself very seriously. But postmodernism is really is the defining philosophical movement of the last third of the 20th century. And it exists in literature, it exists in music, in painting, and virtually every philosophical and creative discipline. And it has to do with recognition on the very simplest level that there is no single stream of ideas at any moment. We're not living in the Middle Ages where the church was dominant in the society and everything else ascribed to a doctrine of singularity. And it goes beyond that. But suppose we are still in the postmodern period. And the fact that Frank Gehry, whom I like as a person, and I do actually like quite a few of his buildings, and his museums do work better than many others.
And they're often given credit for, I agree.
Right. But I think that, Frank can do one thing, and then if he needs the elaborate, Frank flying in space, and then if he has to do a concert hall for a struggling symphony in Miami, he does a very simple box.
Yeah.
That ability to design each project on its own terms and do what is at least the architect and the client and maybe the civic group think is appropriate, as opposed to just ramming something down, this is the style of the moment, we all must adhere to it, is a postmodern gesture. Right. So we are in a period of postmodernism. When I go back to teaching at Yale in the fall, I think I'm going to give a seminar. It's going to be more work for me, and I don't know if any students will take it, but I'll take the risk. What was and what is postmodernism? I think young architecture students are suddenly extremely interested, which if you know in any discipline, a generation of about 30, 35 years, they want to know the new thing, but the new thing, they say, oh my God, it's the old thing, just come back.
Right. Everything old is new again.
Everything old is new again. Anyhow, postmodernism, the style, probably has run its course. I think Paul described quite rightly. Some of us said, let's not play with the past, let's really learn about the past. And in order to work in the languages of the past, now I speak as a school marm, you have to learn how to do that. Architects up until 1950 were disciplined in how to draw columns, ornament. Maybe too much emphasis was put on ink washes and things like that. But they knew how big things were and how moldings took the light and why if you did it one way or another it would react differently, how to compose a building. The word composition has dropped out of architecture as though it was a kind of cardinal sin that has symmetry, asymmetry, balance, and so forth. So we've tried to reintroduce it at Yale. Other architects are trying to do it, but we have, as a generation, my generation, had to teach it to ourselves. We are, in that sense, autodidacts. And how do you learn? By looking at buildings.
You made a reference a moment ago to the sort of what I guess we could call the tectonic nature of architecture, the fact that at the end of the day it is about the real physical object. How much are we in danger of losing that in a digital age when so much experience is virtual, when also so much designing is done now through digital means and not on paper? Is there an equivalency between the physical act of drawing with a pencil on tracing paper and the real physicality of a building as opposed to the digital world of designing through CAD and so forth?
Well, you have a bundle.
There are a bundle of questions there, but they all have certain relations.
Let's start about drawing.
Please feel free to unbundle.
I think many psychologists and people who deal with the mind will agree that the connection between a drawing, a mental perception, and what you see is fundamental to the creative act, not only for artists, but for people who write, for people who make notations. So I think, Frank Gehry, for example, as many people think of him as Mr. Digital, he hardly knows how to work a computer.
That's correct, yeah.
He draws. And his drawings are little wacko sketches, and then he makes models with his people.
Right.
And you build up a scheme.
He makes a very important distinction between the computer as an act of creation and the computer as an act of execution.
The computer is a great tool, and it helps a great deal in the production of drawings for buildings. And it is already making possible traditional forms of buildings unimaginable, because you can now quarry stone in Indiana, ship it to Canada, where they're more sophisticated, and put it on precast panels, which have all been designed meticulously. The stone has been carved digitally, based on hand sketches by people, and then you ship it to New Haven, and you have two new Gothic colleges. So they're Gothic, they're brick and stone, and so forth. So it makes possible things that people said 30 years ago were no longer possible. But I believe we have to, as a society, be very wary about the computer and digitalization and robotics, because this is a problem. People don't have jobs. And if the robots are doing all this stuff, what are people going to do? So we need to train people who want to be trained in how to make things, how to carve, how to draw, how to assemble things. If you go to the Albert show, you see he made these furniture. He designed it, and he made his own furniture, as I believe did, no, I can't think of the architect's name, but he's in the show next door.
Lawrence Coker.
Well, Lawrence Coker.
Right.
So, the computer's here to stay. I'm a little scared about when it's driving the car I'm in or somebody else is in, but worry about maybe. But I do believe, I'm not afraid of the computer, but I don't think it's a substitute for the way art is made. And indeed, how come in the world of galleries in Chelsea or here at the Wexner Center, you don't see very much computer art on the wall?
Right.
Because it's not very interesting.
Right.
Painters are still painting. They're still drawing from life.
Yep.
Why?
Yep. I'm fascinated by what you said about the creation of those new colleges at Yale. In a way, it's not unlike Frank Gehry making a facade that is full of 1,000 different kinds of pieces that could only be assembled digitally, even though they look very different and they may represent different ideas. They actually emerge through a similar process.
Well, many people in the room probably don't know the tradition of Gothic buildings at Yale, which goes back to the beginning of the 19th century.
Right. And
the buildings were built in the more or less traditional way, like some of your buildings here around the Oval at Ohio State. But by the time the 1920s, Yale expanded enormously and built these so-called residential colleges. They built them in the Gothic style, but largely because they thought that connecting to Oxford and Cambridge and the monastic tradition would elevate the students past the banalities of football weekends and things like that. They were in part correct, only in part, but in part. But people lampooned the architect James Gamble Rogers, who designed many of them, because they were steel-framed buildings with concrete slabs. He wasn't against modern material.
No, he wanted to make modern buildings.
Modern Gothic buildings.
Yes.
And those buildings are the ones that everybody cherishes.
Sure.
So our buildings, the two new residential colleges, 900 students, that's a lot of students, are in that tradition. And how did we get to that tradition? I never drew a Gothic building in my life. Myself, my partners, many people in the office, we measured, we walked, we studied, we read stuff by Paul Goldberger and others. But Paul was one of the first people to say James Gamble Rogers is a serious architect.
Yes, it's true. Thank you.
So everything is possible if you don't have horse blinders as an architect. The problem with modernism was it imposed those kinds of horse blinders, said this is what modern architecture is going to be about. And the vocabulary, as Paul Rudolph, my teacher said, ran from quoting a comment on Katharine Hepburn's acting abilities that a critic had made. The modern architecture's vocabulary runs from A to B.
Right. That's right.
Enough said.
Right. And whereas it is amazing to think that at the end of the day, the least important thing about the James Gamble Rogers buildings was the style itself. I mean, it was really about proportion and scale and material
and detail. You're being a modernist. The style is very important.
But let me say, what made them really good was not that.
It connects a student coming out of some high school somewhere in America who's been in some building that looks like it's been designed like a reformatory for kids, and they go to a place like Yale, and my God, they connect with a 1,000-year tradition of architecture and the monastic tradition, the scholastic tradition, all of that's involved. It's how the buildings look, how they perform, as well as all other things.
It did it for me. I mean, I went to Yale excited about the modern buildings, and then I fell in love with these Gothic buildings that you weren't supposed to like if you were serious about architecture. And I kept trying to come to terms with why were they giving me such pleasure then? I mean, was there something dirty like sex that you weren't supposed to like, all this traditional architecture?
Well, the pleasure principle in architecture is almost never discussed.
Yeah.
Aesthetics these days is hardly ever discussed in public, and probably not even in private. There are all kinds of other issues that are constantly being paraded out, but architecture is an art. And it should make beautiful things, and beautiful things connect. I mean, the painter John Curran, who's quite well known, he graduated the Yale School of Art, of course, that's why I mentioned him, but he paints in a way that is figural. Everybody said figural art is dead. Well, that's ridiculous. The human being is subject of a very interesting, endlessly interesting to each of us. That's why we go to the Standard Hotel so we can look out the window, or we stand at the Standard Hotel and look at the people in the window near the Whitney downtown. Anyhow, I just think I grew into architecture at a time when everybody told me, not me personally, but us, you can't do that, you can't do this, it's not done, it's not modern. Baloney. Everything is possible if you do it with passion, intelligence, quality, discipline. That's the things you measure a work of art.
The notion that there is a style for the time is probably the most fraudulent of all concepts, I suppose. And after all, if one might argue that if Gothic is wrong today, how could it have been acceptable when James Gamble Rogers did it? It's not as though 1920 was all that much closer to the Middle Ages. I mean, it's another, I mean, what does another 75 years mean when you're talking 1,000? So it was either not valid at all after 1100 or 1200, or it's valid in both times, it seems to me.
Well, I think it was a great expression of passion and art in the Middle Ages, and it survived in a weakened way as the classical revival of what we call the Renaissance tradition. But by the 19th century, it was very much back in full bear as an antidote or a complement. But I mean, the idea of buildings as styles for the time, nothing looks more dated than a 1980s dress or suit. Nobody wants to wear hip-hugger pants anymore. So, fashion, you throw it out, or you put it in the back of your closet and you revive it later, or you give it to the Costume Institute or whatever. But buildings can't be just for the moment. They're for 100 years, maybe 1,000 years. So you have to build buildings that think about the big tradition. Again, I quote my teachers, I believe in education, and if you have great teachers, which I was lucky to have, Philip Johnson came to Yale, went to the chalkboard, they had them, we still have them, and he wrote on the board, "You cannot not know history." And this was Johnson, who brought the international style to America, had studied under Gropius and was a passionate advocate for Mises architecture, and he realized it was a dead end. You had to go back to go forward. So that's where I am. I'm still going forward, Paul. You're not going to put me back in the back.
I'm not trying to, but I do want you to tell me a little bit more about the pleasure principle and what it means in architecture, since it's you who brought in that phrase.
Well, when I look at certain buildings by some of my colleagues, and I see jangling shapes going this way and that way for no visually apparent reason to me, and I see rampant use of materials that are best suited for foundations and highway abutments.
I can't imagine what building that you saw this afternoon might be prompting those thoughts, actually.
And I see ramps that look like they were from the LA freeway, as opposed to an easy way to get from place to place and just simply agonize the journey. I'm not getting much pleasure out of that. When I see other buildings with beautiful brickwork or stonework, beautifully laid up, beautiful joints, carefully composed facade, great round arch like you have a Romanesque building on the Oval, wonderful roof lines, how buildings meet the sky, everything jumps of shape. It gives me pleasure. Gives a lot of people pleasure. If it didn't, everybody would try to live in houses made out of reinforced concrete with ramps going this way and that. Honey, I'm home. Well, wait a minute, I'll drive up the ramp and I'll get there. I mean, it's not that hard to do a nice building. You really have to work at it to make a really bad building.
Let's talk, before we go on to slides, for one moment about that Romanesque building on the Oval. That building, I agree with you, it's a wonderful building and brings forth all the positive and pleasant associations you mentioned, but it certainly does say 1880s to me. It's not as though it's not marked by its time in a very clear way.
Every building, I would say, speaks of its moment.
Okay.
But if it only speaks of its moment, then when that moment passes, what have you got? Whereas those Romanesque revival buildings in the Richardsonian tradition of the late 19th century, when H.H. Richardson reached his maturity, he didn't live to be more than 48 years old. It's amazing what he accomplished. And he influenced a whole generation of architects. But when he got to his maturity, he went back to Europe, where he had studied at the École des Beaux-Arts, and he went to the south of France and the north of Spain only to look at Romanesque buildings. Right. And he bought postcards, which was the easiest way to bring them back.
He was not going to shoot with his smartphone. Yeah.
Exactly. And so that building has a memory, and it has its place in its time, and that's fine. Even this building on the outside, you can look at the Mershon Auditorium and you say, well, it's a kind of late gasp of the Art Deco. It's probably 1948 if I put a date on it, but I don't really know. So it connects, but a lot of the buildings we have are only of the moment, and consequently, maybe not so interesting when the moment's over. Time will tell.
And yet also things often fall very dramatically out of favor and come back. I mean, look at Art Deco from the 30s, look at Victorian architecture from England. I think
you always want to get rid of grandma's architecture.
Right.
You actually want to get rid of grandma when you're young. She has bad breath. She's always telling you what to have nice table manners. She does all those terrible things. Then if you're lucky enough and grandma lives long enough and you come to your own senses, you realize grandma had wonderful things to contribute. And you begin to appreciate grandma. And that's the way of the world. But Paul has been very involved in preservation, certainly, and so have I. And protecting grandma from her grandchildren is really a full-time job.
Right. I think Sir John Summerson once wrote that I think all architecture has to die before it touches the historical imagination. Which I think we have to sort of hate it before we come back and really accept it for the long term.
But not to beat this horse deader than I've been beating it.
Deader than grandma already is?
No, grandma will leave her alone. But the typical corporate building of the 50s and still being built in one form or another is a clip-on architecture. So you build a steel frame or a concrete frame, and then you have a curtain wall typically of glass, but sometimes other things.
Right.
You can unbolt that damn thing and put something else up. I've done glass buildings. I hope it won't happen to me. to my buildings, but I think that if you build them in a more complex way with materials and integrated systems like Lucan, you can't tear down a Lucan building.
Not easily, no.
It's too,
Thankfully, no one's trying.
No one's trying. Well, we don't know.
Good.
You never know what's going on.
Let's look at a couple of images and talk a little bit about a few of your interesting and unusual projects. Here's a building that was not built. This was your proposal for the Chicago Tribune late entries competition.
That was in the
back in
early
the 70s,
days
right?
when you're a young architect, quite rightly, I would argue, and I would support any young architect in school here or wherever. You want to make a lot of noise.
Right.
Get yourself out there, and wonderful opportunities do come up. Architects, and design competitions. That's often hard, a very expensive, painful way to make some noise if you're lucky. But Stanley Tigerman and a few architects in Chicago, to celebrate, I guess it was the 60th anniversary of the Chicago Tribune competition.
Something, yeah.
So famous, the first competition internationally.
Might have actually even been the 50th. It was 24 or so, 22, 20,
Well,
or maybe 60th.
Yeah,
maybe,
it was
whatever.
60.
Okay.
So I thought, well, there was a famous scheme for the competition which was never given a prize, but it was designed by the famous Viennese architect Adolf Loos. And he was one of the only Europeans who had actually ever been to America, and moreover, he had worked in Chicago. So he knew what a newspaper was, and he knew that newspapers had columnists. So he designed a column, classical column. And there's an argument that it was a joke, but I don't think. I think he was totally serious, and it's a very interestingly and well-worked-out building. So I thought, well, what not my homage to Loos, using glass, by the way, and showing that glass, instead of being this neutral surface that Mies in Chicago advocated, having no a material without qualities in a way, we would use colored glass, which was becoming very popular and possible, and that was our scheme. And it's a provocation. That's all.
Okay.
Of course, I'd be prepared to build it.
And here's what some of those ideas have matured into in a real building you've just finished in Lower Manhattan.
We just inaugurated this building, which is a Four Seasons hotel and luxury condominiums above. It's a freestanding tower.
It's the center of the image, should there be any doubt here.
Yeah, I hope there is no doubt. But it's right next to the World Trade Center site, and it was developed by Larry Silverstein, whose name you may know from reading about the efforts to rebuild the Trade Center. He's been a kind of hero, but also a very successful hero, financial success. Anyhow, this was the closest I've come yet to pay homage to those buildings which Sherry said I could see out the front window of the subway going into the skyline of Manhattan. And I should point out, I was born in 1939, just before the Second World War. Nothing had happened in New York of any consequence architecturally from 1929 until like the late 1950s. The Depression curtailed all construction, and then the Second World War. And it took a while for the city to get its mojo up again. So the skyline of the city of my youth, when I was 10, 12, 14 years of age, was the skyline of the 1920s. There were no big, fat, stupid, flat buildings, all of which should deserve to be taken down, really. They ruined the great orchestration of man-made towers, which Lower Manhattan was. So I'm trying, and some other architects as well, and the Woolworth Building, which is our next-door neighbor, is being restored at great cost. We're trying to reappreciate by preservation, but preservation isn't enough. You have to take what you admire and make more of it.
Good. Here's something else from your early years, a house that's still there on Park Avenue, right?
It's the same sentiment at work in a way, but here to make a building that was part of the wall of the street. It was an anomalous site, had a wonderful client. There was a townhouse here, but we tore most of it down. It wasn't very distinguished. Maybe in history might say this wasn't so distinguished, but it's protected by landmarks, so it'll be here forever. But to show you could make a kind of classical composition, an implied pediment, but I was very timid. I was scared as an architect to do this. What would what would my teachers think, some of them? What would Serge Shamayev say, who hated me for destroying modern architecture? Walter Gropius was just cool in the grave. I mean, so, but
Yeah,
this
it had
was
the piano
taken,
nobile.
there were
It has-
piano
right,
nobile,
right,
there are
right.
pilasters on the side, there's a strong symmetrical organization to the building. There's the two doors. You don't know where the front door is, and of course, I was thinking of Le Corbusier's Villa Gare.
Stein, right.
Villa Stein at
Gosh,
Gare.
yeah.
So there are many memories of this. Inside, there's a kind of free-flowing, I don't know what other slide you picked of it, free-flowing interior, which regrettably doesn't exist anymore because there was a terrible fire inside the house, and it's not there.
Good. Here's another house from, I guess, a little bit later in New Jersey.
Yes, but this is a pool, swimming pool added onto a Georgian house, a very kind of dull but substantial house. And this was an indoor swimming pool. And there they are in northern New Jersey, where the weather isn't like Columbus, Ohio. It's cold and nasty. And they wanted an indoor swimming pool. Most indoor swimming pools are horrible places. They reek of chlorine. They have no charm. So I thought, I saw an interior by Hans Hollein in Austria, and he'd had columns to get people to go to Israel. Imagine Israel tourism in the center of Vienna, and you get a kind of sense of what was going on. And I said, wow, we'll make an oasis there. And many other materials are used and so forth, but it's a pleasure palace. You go in there, and it's fun. It's not for torture.
It's interesting that there really
Exercise should be fun,
Right.
and if it isn't fun, don't exercise.
Right.
I don't exercise.
There really is a theme of sensuous pleasure that brings a lot of this through. Here's one of my favorite houses, actually, because I think I put this on the cover of a book once.
Regrettably gone.
Not the book, the house, not the book.
The book is still available, but the house.
No, actually, the book's out of print too, so it's all.
I
gone.
had to tear that.
But you had to tear it down.
Yeah, it was a wonderful commission, a little house right on the dunes facing the Atlantic Ocean for a guy who'd just gotten a divorce, and he said, I'm never going to get married again. The first time was the worst time I've ever had in my life. So we built this little house, and I was a student of Vincent Scully's, and the book of the Shingle Style is one of the most important art historical texts of the second half of the 20th century, certainly in America. And so this was maybe my first best shingle style house. Why did we tear it down? Well, for one thing, it was an object building, and the guy got married, and he called me up and said, I want to add on to your house. I said, Tom, you told me you were not going to get married. You promised. And adding on to it was just like having a thing sticking in me. I couldn't do it.
Right.
But the rising sandy tide
So
and
the
all that.
site became dangerous.
It had to be dangerous, so we did a new
right.
house for new owners, pulled back from the water. It was sad to tear it down.
Yeah. Here's we're moving out of postmodernism, but clearly not yet.
Oh no, these are the oldies but goodies.
right,
This is
right.
like watching something on public television.
Yeah, actually, we're watching the Turner
Are they-
classic movies of
Is
Stern,
that group
I think.
still alive? Yes.
Right.
Do you really want to see them? What they look like age 65, when you remember them when they were 30 or 25?
Okay.
Probably not.
It's
But
Turner classic movies time.
this is, but this goes to the point of what was, in my view, the problem with modernism, corporate modernism. This is an office building, speculative office building for the great developer Gerald Hines. The first time I had a chance to work with him. And it's just a glass box. All of that is glass, but you could, as in the Chicago Tribune competition scheme, you could work with the colors of the glass and give a suggestion of masonry. But Jerry likes masonry, and he loves stone, in particular from Portugal at that time. He said, can't you throw some stone at this project? So we made a frontispiece based on the work of Claude Nicolas Ledoux, who was being much discussed in the revival of classicism among modernists and anti-modernists alike at this moment, made this entranceway. So you could take a speculative box in a suburban office building and give it a dignity and presence which it didn't have at the time, using classical tropes. Another shingle-style house, we could go through many of them, but it does show that we had an American architecture of great power coming out of Richardson and others after the Civil War, and it led to Frank Lloyd Wright, and he took it in a kind of eccentric but brilliant way. But this tradition, by the time I was in school, people didn't even think these kinds of buildings were designed by architects. So Scully's book reintroduced it, gave it an intellectual framework. And some of us, Robertson, whose name I mentioned, who's built here at OSU and out in New Albany and Easton, and I and others, we realized this was a language of architecture that had classical elements, had American barn traditions, goes back to the very earliest settlers' buildings in New England, and speaks to people. And you can find this tradition in the 19th century all the way to the 1950s, all across the country. And we just simply gave it a little injection.
Good. And you began to go international.
Yeah, this, unfortunately, you can't, from this photo, appreciate what this is. It's actually in the middle of
a street, right?
It faces the bourse of Berlage in Amsterdam, and it's two department stores occupy it, but we were brought in because the city of Amsterdam has something called the Beauty Committee. It's a torture, I assure you, and they never know quite what is beautiful, but they know what they think isn't beautiful.
Right.
And we went through a process, and this building, which is a long facade with shop windows below and attic story above, is an interpretation of one of the great traditions that evolved in Dutch architecture, the so-called Amsterdam School. And its progenitor is right across the street, the great building by Berlage. So it's very important. It's not quite finished, and these are kind of mannequins in the window. And this is do they really want to see all these buildings?
Well, we can go quickly through them.
This is a fine art studio at the UC Irvine campus, one of the new California campuses when California was embarked on a great expansion. It's a studio building. It's a typical academic building where every department which had been begging for some space got that much, pencil storage for your department. But this is a more interesting story, I would say, because I began to work with the Disney company, and under Michael Eisner, the president of the Disney company at the time, he and I got on famously because what are Disney buildings about? They tell stories. And his idea was, you go to Disneyland or Disney World, and you've seen Disney movies, why can't you live the experience of the Disney movies, not only in rides and so forth, but when you put your little head down on a pillow at night? So theming the hotels, instead of just making them look like they were anywhere by Hilton or whomever, he did that. And then the animators, and this is the really important part of the story, going back to drawings, the animators were in a death battle to prove that hand drawing could survive. And Roy Disney, the nephew of Walt, was their champion. So we built this huge building, and it expresses the bravado and spirit. It's right next to the main freeway that leads into Burbank, and across the street is the Disney Studio, which is a lovely complex of buildings in and of itself. It's a campus, and then they said you have to have a special office for Roy Disney because he smokes cigars, and you couldn't smoke on the buildings. So I did a sorcerer's hat for him, and that's his office.
So that was his office. Wow.
His office. Wow. But if you look at this building in detail, you see everything from film sprockets on that top. You see the deco of Kem Weber's campus across the street, so it pays attention to that. You see a dynamism which relates to the freeway. I always wanted to have a building that when they did traffic reports, they could say, traffic is building up on the 134 in animation, and they do. So it's fun. Most architects don't have fun. I try to have fun. Most clients don't have fun Very few really enjoy the process, but when they do, wow, magic occurs. Okay. This is a library at a boarding school in New Hampshire. It's a school that has a Gothic tradition of building that goes back to the 1850s. They needed a new library. It was done around 1990, just at the moment of the switch. People were beginning to think of digitization in libraries. But it is a building that you can see is photographed under a Gothic arch of a chapel across the way by the great architect Henry Vaughan, but it had a connecting piece to a building that got torn down by Bertrand Grover and Goodyear.
Okay, good.
So, and architects in the 19th century designed in all different styles.
Yeah.
And why must we be pigeonholed into one style or another? It's ridiculous. Even fashion designers get to fiddle around. So why can't architects get to
You've talked already.
These are the Disney hotels.
Yeah.
That's my own house. The great reward for being a famous architect is you get to live in a remodeled 1930s one-bedroom house.
Which you turned into something more, however.
A remodeled two-bedroom house. And this is celebration, and that's brings, I think, if we stop with the slides with this, probably we're running out of time, but you have here.
I want to get to just a couple more
New
current
Albany,
things too, so we'll go
I had a
quickly.
little hand in at the beginning when Les Wexner and Jack Kessler had this idea of building a town, and we really were just sitting with Jack Robertson, whose name has come up, and Jerry McHugh, the dean then at Harvard, the Graduate School of Design. And we went to Europe, we looked at things, we studied and so forth, and we looked at Bexley, which has this charming little enclave of houses, which I'm sure many of you know. So New Albany is not as urban as the town some of us may have had in mind.
Right.
But then the Disney company, Michael Eisner, said, I think we should build a town. We had this site. They didn't have any conceivable use for it. It had a lot of wetlands that had to be addressed, and he set out to build a town. And Michael gets into things very deeply, as great clients like Les Wexner get into things deeply. So Robertson did the golf clubhouse on one end. We worked together on the town center. Both of us as architects, we did one building next to the other person's building. Can you imagine Eisenman and Gary and others doing buildings next to each other to create a street? I frankly cannot.
That's called the University of Cincinnati, I think.
Yeah. The Boulevard of Broken Dreams. One of the worst examples of non-coordinated planning. Coordinating planning with grand ambition.
Quickly, before we adjourn, at a couple of more recent things. Here you
should go to Celebration. It's a great place to see a town that's really become a success.
Here you experimented with the Stanford Mediterranean Spanish mission style.
Yeah, at Stanford, when you are about ready to send your kids to Stanford, it's a great university, and they always show you pictures of the buildings of Richardson and his partners designed. They don't show you the rest of Stanford. It's a mess. It's a mess. But they have this rule that every building has to have a red tile roof on it. Right. So they're wearing little yarmulkes, these buildings. You know what a yarmulke is. It looks ridiculous, and they are not good buildings. But so we were given this commission, and Graham Wyatt is here in the office, and he worked on this, to work on, Bill Gates was giving the first gift he'd ever given. He wasn't even married yet when he did this. And then Paul Allen gave another part of it. And it was for computer science. That's the god at Stanford. And everybody wanted a traditional Stanford building, and it works. And we reopened a quarry in Santa Barbara to get the stone that didn't turn out so good, so we got it from Minnesota. But you can revive a language, and inside this building there were robots wandering around on the day it opened. So it has nothing to do, it's a building about Stanford. Robots have gone on, they're probably wearing red tile roofs on them. It's about the place, it's about the memory. And when Richardson, the partners came out there, when Richardson built the campus, which was brand new, in a place that had nothing, no architectural traditions. He remembered the Romanesque, southern Spain, and that's what he
And
did.
made one, right,
And he
which
put
you-
palm trees in it.
Which, your point is that that was largely abandoned and you revived
well,
in
well,
effect.
not-
Yes, yes. And,
This is a restoration.
and
This is a library in Miami. Miami's just at the end of the Art Deco district. People don't support libraries. They talk about how important libraries are, but they don't support them, and you can't. It's very hard to get money out of the local government. They did get money for this library, and next door, across the street, is the Tectonics and Ballet School,
right.
and across the way is a museum that Isesaki was trying to remodel. I don't know. I think it's not going so well, but we did a library that belongs in Miami Beach.
Right,
I
right,
think it does.
right. And you did a very different one in Nashville.
The Athens of the South.
Right, okay.
And opposite, it's on the axis right to one of the great state capitals in the United States and one of the great classical buildings ever, William Strickland's State House for Tennessee. And they talk to each other, and these slides don't give you a chance to. You're just going to have to believe me, of course.
Good.
I always talk honestly about my buildings.
And then you did something very different in Chapel Hill.
Yeah,
What is-
because this is an addition to a hideous 1950s building, so we're not going to, and we had to remodel it, and we're not going to lay upon that building some.
something that
not
looks like Nashville. Right,
No.
right, right. Right, good.
Eero Saarinen, the great architect, died very young and left a great legacy of buildings, and he had a theory which was derided in my days as a student and long after, the style for the job. He said, every project has its own meanings, and our job as an architect is to find the right meaning and give it form.
Which is why you did a glass skyscraper for
Comcast, I mean, Comcast isn't going to want to be in a classical building. They want to be, they want to take over Silicon Valley and everything else, and and it's a high-tech company, and this is a glass building, but it's a glass building with a profile it suggests an obelisk. It uses two kinds of glass, so it has kind of corners that hold themselves, and it has an amazing, if I must say so myself, lobby in the bottom of it, which is a major public place in the city of Philadelphia now. So a public, even a corporate office building and a wonderful plaza, which Laurie Olin, who worked on New Albany, Laurie Olin worked with us on it. It's a great public place.
It's not a box.
It's not a box.
The other point, I think. And here's a quick view of what may be the most famous recent building in New York.
Well, it belongs to the history of real estate as well as the
Yes,
history of
yes,
architecture. It's a condominium building facing Central Park, and it's all clad in limestone. The limestone was put on panels in Canada, and concrete panels, and brought down and assembled. So it's more modern in construction than many glass buildings that you see. But it's filled with memories and details and a deliberate evocation of what New Yorkers think are the great buildings of the pre-war era.
Right.
The defining buildings. And it's met with, I'm happy to say, great success among New Yorkers and Americans and certain international people, but it's mostly filled with American, including A-Rod lived there. So
Therefore what, right, exactly.
When he was-
exactly. Yes. But now, Bob, here's a building you've just finished in Taipei.
Right.
That looks, to me, not that dissimilar. So explain
well,
how...
one has a vocabulary.
Okay, right.
But the lady who built this building appeared in our office, and she introduced herself. She was beautifully coiffed and dressed, and she said, "I'm welding a building in Taipei, and I want to hire an architect." Well, I said, "You come to the right place." She went to 15 Central Park West. We got her in, which is harder to get in than Fort Knox. And she said, "I want that." And we said, "Well, do you think it's right for Taipei?" She said, "It's right." So we went to Taipei. There are so many horrendous classical rip-offs of buildings in Taipei. They needed this building desperately, desperately. So, of course, we live in a global, there's a whole other issue. We could keep
Right.
these people trapped in here for another hour. Global versus local. The exchange of ideas, what you do. But, if you go to the Bund in Shanghai, you see some of the most wonderful miniature classical deco skyscrapers of the 1920s and 30s. It was a cross-pollinization. But if you look at those buildings carefully, there's a lot that's really Chinese about them. So if you looked at this building carefully, you would find
you would
many
find
things
there
that are very
okay.
different from 15 Central Park.
And that's, actually, let's skip over this and end with this, which speaks to your point, I think.
Well, this is a
very
very
recent
complicated project. You're going to be here for an hour
No,
now.
no. Tell us quickly.
The investor and prominent philanthropist Stephen Schwarzman, established with $100 million gift of his own and raised $300 million, actually much more now, to establish the equivalent of the Rhodes Scholarship, but situated on the Tsinghua campus in Beijing. Tsinghua is one of the literally top universities. It's like the MIT of China. And it has brought, because it's now open for business, American students, a certain percentage, Chinese students, a certain percentage, and international students, a certain percentage. And unlike the Rhodes Scholarship, where scholars like Bill Clinton would live in a college, one of the residential colleges at Oxford, here the students live here. It's because of the language problems and because it's an immersion of 1 year intensely. So Stephen had a little competition of architects, and some perfectly nice architects gave him some perfectly nice buildings, which you would find on perfectly nice American campuses. And he said, what does that have to do with China? The problem with China is people go to China today, they see the beautiful cities and neighborhoods being torn down. They see buildings being built that could be in Kansas, and with all due respect, Columbus, Ohio. What's going on? I want a Chinese building. And so this is modeled on a Chinese house, because traditional Chinese architecture never grew much more than the scale of a house. Right. But it always had principles of courtyards and gardens. And so we set out to build this house, this building. It's very hard to build a traditional building in China because the craftsmanship has almost all gotten killed in the cultural.
IMP discovered
well,
that
I
when
learned,
he tried
yes,
to do
and we went
Fragrant
and
Hill.
looked at IMP's building.
Right,
It's the only.
right.
It's interesting. IMP, who did concrete buildings all over the world, when he did his first building in China, he did a traditional Chinese style building.
Right.
It's his home country. He knew what. So we did this, and people learned how to build, and I'm very proud. It's the regular Beijing brick. People said, you can't build out of Beijing brick. It's an ugly material. I said, look around, this forbidden city. Everything is made of this beautiful material. On and on. I don't want to bore you all. It's there. It's being used. And it's giving people who come here, and also coming here, this is meant to be also like the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, where great international academics and politicians and so on come and spend a day or two, live with the students or not, give lectures. People come here and they say, this makes sense on this campus, because if you saw this campus, it was designed by Joseph Stalin.
Yeah, it's pretty hard. I've been
beyond
it's pretty grim.
Grim.
It makes OSU feel like the University of Virginia.
Yeah.
Something I
Yeah.
think.
Ironically, the original building for Tsinghua is modeled on the University of Virginia and was done by a Yale graduate. So the circle is full.
Well, I knew we would find a way to conclude with a mention of Yale.
That's right.
I think, Bob. So, but in the
Listen,
end,
I
it
have
really
to push the brand, you know?
it is about sense of place in the end. I mean, is that the
memory,
ultimate mission?
Memory, place, the courage one gets when those things. I mean, not to go on forever, but if someone says to you, and they meet your son or your daughter, and they say they look just like you, don't you feel proud? Or if a kid is said, oh, I know who you are. You look just like your mother. Or you have, don't you feel connected to something bigger than yourself? That's what building should be about.
That's a wonderful line on which to end. Bob, thank you very, very much. And thanks to all of you for being here.
Thank you for coming.
Great.
Thank you.